Hello everyone, Happy New Year. Today I'm bringing you a conversation that I had recently with Claudia Young. Claudia is a PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne in the School of Culture and Communication. Her research focuses on the ideology of the manosphere and how it's being mainstreamed. We also discuss her honours thesis research, which focused on incels, the involuntary celibate movement. And we also discuss a seminal and foundational text in gender theory, Masculinities by Raewyn Connell. I think this was a really, really interesting conversation. Everyone knows about the manosphere and the pernicious effects that it's having on society. Fair warning though, the audio in this episode isn't the best. Fortunately, the issues seem to mostly be on my end with my microphone, so Claudia sounds a lot better than I do, which in this case is great because she's the expert, so she's the one you want to listen to for this episode, not me. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a rating wherever you listen to it. It really does help with the visibility of the show. So without further ado, please enjoy. Okay, we're rolling. Thanks for coming on, Claudia.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I think the most logical way to do this would just to be sort of to briefly talk about your research so people have an idea of where you're coming from while we discuss the text Masculinities. So how would you characterize your research? What are you doing?
So what I'm researching is the mainstreaming of the manosphere in the Department of Media Communications, and I'm kind of looking at how these ideologies of the manosphere, so the manosphere kind of being the anti-feminist communities that exist online and kind of notoriously include incels, pickup artists, men going their own way, have kind of more recently, I think the more recent definition of the manosphere has broadened to kind of encapsulate these like manfluencer podcasts like Joe Rogan, Theo Von. And I'm kind of trying to understand how these discourses, which originated in what were quite subcultural spaces online, have made their way into the mainstream. So why is it that 15-year-old boys nowadays all know what mogging is, or they're all trying to look smacks, and why have these ideas become so popular? Does that?
Oh, yeah, that was great. I was going to ask you to define the manosphere.
Oh, yes.
You did a good job at that. So people would obviously be very familiar with Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate, but perhaps of some of the more niche figures, less so. But you also placed like Joe Rogan and Theo Von on, you didn't say they're in the manosphere, but they're kind of like the spectrum. How do you understand their relationship to the manosphere?
Yeah, I think so part of the difficulty of studying the manosphere and even defining it is its amorphousness and the ways in which it kind of responds to context, and the ways in which it's kind of often, collapsing or expanding based on, mainstream conceptions and that kind of thing. So I would suggest that like Joe Rogan and Theo Von, though not squarely within the manosphere, are kind of I guess ideological intermediaries, right? So people who toy with manosphere ideas will engage with very like entrenched manosphere influences like Jordan Peterson, and so thus kind of often act as like a gateway into the true manosphere.
And because you're interested in the mainstreaming of the manosphere, do you see like Joe Rogan as being one of the ways in which that happens? Because a lot of people who wouldn't ever want to listen to Andrew Tate would perhaps sometimes listen to Joe Rogan. Is that like one of the ways in which that happens?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I guess something that I'm kind of thinking about in this concept of mainstreaming is that it's not necessarily just a one-way relationship, right? Like it's not necessarily just these subcultural ideas that are being filtered out into the mainstream. It's also the ways in which the mainstream influences these subcultures. So I think these relationships are often quite symbiotic, or it's a lot more cyclical than it is just kind of like a one-way pipeline.
And how did you get interested in researching the manosphere?
But yes, I get asked this a lot. So I guess the short answer is I like kind of stumbled upon incels sometime during my undergrad. But kind of became super fascinated with the anti-feminism and the virulence of it. And then wrote my honors thesis on incel ideology and mostly like identity formation in the incel community and boundary work that was happening in those communities, gatekeeping and that kind of thing. Yeah. But I guess more broadly, my interest kind of stems back to being a teenage girl on Tumblr. And I guess, we were talking about off mic before about Gamergate. I kind of witnessed from afar Gamergate occurring. I watched Anita Sarkeesian. She was one of my early feminist influences as a teenager. And so I kind of remember Gamergate happening, and it opened my eyes to this whole parallel universe that was existing in tandem with my very, woke SJW Tumblr bubble of this like completely misogynistic, homophobic, racist, parallel world that was kind of forming on platforms like 4chan and Reddit at the same time that I was, and up until that point, fairly ignorant of.
Interesting. Yeah, because I was going to ask, when you say that you encountered incels during your undergrad, you ended up writing your honors on it. I was going to ask, when you say encounter, was that in an academic context or was it in the personal context?
No, it was in an academic context. It was I remember it was for this methods class that I was taking, and we did a week on documentary, and we were asked to kind of like find these short documentaries online and show them to the class. And one of the other groups showed this Vice documentary about incels, and that kind of just like sparked my obsession, I guess, for the lack of a better word.
Why did you find them so interesting? Just because it was so like different, as you said before, so different to what you had experienced?
I think so. And I think I mean, I think about this with kind of all of my research. I do think I have a kind of masochistic impulse to look at these horrible things and not look away. Yeah, I think there's something about how truly, truly toxic this community was so interesting to me because, I don't know, maybe my liberal brain had been like, surely things are progressing, things are getting better, right? And so,
Of course, yeah.
like, we're making progress, like women are being seen as equals, blah, blah, blah. And I think that kind of really showed that actually, no, that's not the case across the board. And I think what's happening with the mainstreaming of the manosphere is that we are experiencing an anti-feminist backlash in the same way that Susan Faludi was writing about in like the 90s, I think. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So it struck you as interesting because it kind of affronted this belief you had, perhaps just reflexively, that things are progressive, like let's just get better over time in a kind of linear fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of think that I don't know, I do think that I have pretty good instincts when it comes to seeing how these discourses function online pretty early on, and then seeing them have much larger impacts, a much larger impact over time. And, especially when it comes to, again, the mainstreaming of the manosphere, the mainstreaming of these anti-feminist ideas, I feel like I just keep on being proven right,
That must be a nice feeling to have.
Look, I'd love to be wrong. It was the same thing with the election. It's like, God.
The 2024 selection.
Yes. Again, spending a lot of time in these very far-right online spaces, you kind of get a feel for the general public, like what the general sentiment is. And so I was absolutely not surprised, obviously angered and disappointed that Trump won. But yeah, again, it felt like I was kind of proven right again.
You weren't surprised?
No.
Fair enough. I think everyone probably does know what incel is.
Yes. What I think is really interesting about the incel subculture is kind of the way in which the word incel has taken on a life of its own. And I would say that a lot of incels actually disagree with the public perception of what incels are. So if you spend any time on their forums, you'll very, very quickly come to understand that there is a lot of contestation about identity, about the boundaries of the subculture, and there's kind of this, again, it's very masochistic on their part. There's always this one-upmanship of who can be the biggest incel, right? Like, it's like, well, I'm the ugliest, well, I'm the most neurodivergent, I'm the shortest,
Yeah.
I'm a wrist cell, which is one of my favorites, which is that
I can guess what that means, but can you just tell me what that means?
so wrist cells are incels who believe that their inceldom is caused at least significantly due to their skinny wrists.
Right. Okay. That's very specific.
Yes, they kind of they talk, I would say that they have almost like a plastic surgeon's level knowledge of like the facial structure, and they talk in these very scientific terms about, you know, how far apart your eyes are, how strong your jawline is, all of these things, often in very racialized terms as well. And they're able to kind of dissect every single part about themselves and about others that is not conventionally attractive. And they kind of use this to place themselves on a scale. So what they call the SMV scale, the sexual marketplace value, in which everyone's kind of designated a number between 1 and 10. You know, it's a classic, she's a 10, she's an 8, whatever. And this, from this SMV scale is where they develop this idea of hypergamy, which is the idea that women are dating up. So if a woman is considered a 5, she only wants to date an 8 and above. And incels see themselves as, I guess, the kind of 2s and the 1s on the scale. But because women, in their language, foids, don't want to date what they call their looks match, which is someone who is equal to them on the SMV scale, and they only want to date up, it's resulted in the 1s and the 2s being left behind, not being able to find sexual or romantic partners. Yeah.
Wow, there's so much to say about that. The first thing that struck me was the irony of it, because you often hear people on the right, particularly the people that exist purely to critique political correctness, talking about like the victimhood Olympics, and like people, you know, want to just get points for being like different statuses of victimhood. I'm not white, I'm homosexual, etc. And they critique that. But it sounds like incels are doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even more so.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is this interesting inversion of identity politics, which, yeah, again, is, as you pointed out, is super ironic given their criticisms of identity politics. But I also don't think that that's, you know, unique to incels. Like, you kind of see it across the manosphere, and especially, again, the kind of gamer-gator mentality comes from this, and I guess this kind of going back to masculinity, kind of comes from what has been called this like geek masculinity, which is, you know, technology has often been masculinized in our history of it, in our conceptions of it. If you think about Silicon Valley and the kind of tech bro archetype that's come out of that, but when we think of geeks, they're, you know, kind of the antithesis to the jock, right? Like, they're nerdy, they have like this technological proficiency, but maybe socially inept, probably physically weaker, all of these things, but they're kind of a secret genius. And the thing with geek masculinity is that they get like the kind of self-victimization, or this perception of victimhood, is core to their identity, because they aren't the jock, they aren't the alpha, they aren't the Chad, who they see as top of the hierarchy, and who, you know, in broader society is kind of conceived of as like the top in society.
We've all seen the Chad virgin aid, right?
Exactly. And it's kind of through this perceived victimhood that they then feel a kind of entitlement to certain spaces. So, for example, gaming. And so when they see those spaces as being, you know, I don't know, invaded by interlopers or, you know, the purity or sanctity of which being kind of like, I don't know, like the purity of these spaces being corrupted by women or minorities or identity politics or politics in general, they take this really personally. And because of this victimhood narrative that they've
This is another irony because it sounds like you're describing a safe space, right? Which
yeah,
is something that the right ostensibly is against.
exactly. And you kind of come across these contradictions in the right
Yeah.
all the time. It's like they formulated this language to thrust upon the left and be like, look at all of these bad things these like woke assholes are doing, while we're great, we're fine. Like, you know, it's the kind of, they want, like, it's all a nostalgia for never a past that never existed to begin with. Which I also is like a theme that I'm kind of like constantly coming back to.
Yeah. I mean, the term geek masculinity sounds like an oxymoron, but I guess it goes to something that is spoken about in Masculinities, the text, quite a lot, about how in Western culture, at least, it is a long-standing stereotype in Western philosophy that men are sort of rational, women are irrational, and therefore, like, the intellect's reason, unburdened by emotion, is a hypermasculine trait. And it sounds like they're drawing on that trope.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can kind of see that. I mean, you know, that trope is also across the manosphere. It's often presented in this like very essentialist way, in that this is just how women and men are biologically. This is a biological trait that is inherent to how we are born, and obviously to be rational is better. You know, like this comes up in Jordan Peterson a lot too.
I was just going to say, like, I can sort of see how you went from writing about incels to the manosphere, because is it hypergamy? Is that?
Yeah.
I've heard Peterson talk about that, right? And this idea that, like, he himself often is very essentialist. It's like women are X, men are Y. And in his clinical counseling, he tries to help women become more like masculine, right? So he draws on these essentialist tropes. Is that how, my question was going to be, like, how did you move from researching and writing on incels to then the manosphere? Was it because that you saw those ideas being articulated by people like Peterson, who, in a sense, are pretty mainstream?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much. I would say actually it was Andrew Tate that kind of, I guess, was my kind of alarm bell to be like, oh God, these ideas are really, really gaining traction. Because yeah, I did my honors thesis, finished that in like halfway between. Oh, I finished that in 2021. And then I took 18 months off and was kind of, you know, working a 9 to 5. And in that 18 months off, I just felt like I kept on seeing all of these ideas, which I knew had originated in the incel community, start to just, I don't know, make their way onto my Twitter feed more and more. People started asking me, you know, knowing what my research background, about Andrew Tate, and his name kept on popping up more and more. I think, I want to say in like 2022, he was like the 5th most Googled person or something. That's probably incorrect, but it was something like that. Like his name was just everywhere. And he was, you know, obviously spouting these incredibly misogynistic, like very, very blatantly misogynistic rhetoric. And I think, I mean, probably at the same time, I was coming across Peterson more as well. And yeah, he's an interesting one as well, because as a like ideological intermediary, he is not accepted by real incels, like the kind of quote unquote true cells, as they would call themselves in the incel forums. He's too much of a, as they would say, conservative.
So I can see in that. Yeah, I mean, because he does, you know, he spends a lot of time talking about Christianity and by traditional conservative ideas.
And he,
That's not a full-blown tradcon, but he kind of more leans in that direction.
yeah, and I think in their eyes he would be red-pilled rather than black-pilled.
Okay.
And to them, anyone who isn't black-pilled kind of isn't like a true incel. And obviously, like, Peterson himself is married. He's not actually an incel. He's just kind of, spouted some of these incel ideas.
And just so for people who don't know, being black-pilled is when you completely give up on trying to get female attention, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a nihilistic red pill. So, the red pill's kind of used across the alt-right, though that's now a contested term, in kind of various different ways, but broadly is meant to be that you've woken up to the lies of society, whether that be feminism or, gender ideology or, anything like that. In the incel community, the red pill is about realizing that we live in a misandrous society, that that lookism is the greatest form of oppressor, that how you look is what determines how you exist in the world. But the red pill kind of has like a glimmer of hope. So this is where you kind of get the idea of maxing, whether it be looks maxing, gym maxing,
so you can improve
money maxing.
basically.
Exactly.
And I guess because Jordan Peterson, so much of his appeal is in self-help, I can tell you how he would be is a red pill camp.
Absolutely. Whereas the black pill is like totally nihilistic. It's very essentialist in that it believes that if you're born an ugly, unlovable, unfuckable incel, that there is nothing that you can do to ever, quote unquote, ascend your status. You are forever an incel. You will forever be alone. This is how you kind of get a lot of the language around, and they have a very complex lexicon that they've developed, but a lot of it is like very nihilistic, even in its tone. Whether it be like, they often talk about LDAR, which is to lie down and rot. A lot of them self-identify as NEAT, which is not an education, employment, or training. They're often talking about roping, sui fuel. There's kind of lots of suicidal ideation on these forums and stuff. So yeah, it is. I would say that it's kind of like one of the hardest parts of researching those communities is just how nihilistic and depressing they are, and it feels very difficult to even think about helping these people because it just feels so hopeless.
That is very grim.
Yes.
So you go from incels to the manosphere, from the honours to your PhD, because you started to notice that these ideas were becoming more mainstream through people like Andrew Tate and, to a lesser extent, Jordan Peterson. And so then you start your research, and I think it was either your confirmation seminar, or did you do a presentation before your confirmation seminar?
No, it would have been my confirmation
seminar. So it was your confirmation seminar, which I listened to over Zoom. I think it was before I'd ever met you. I found, but I was interested in the topic. And I heard you mention this book, Masculinities. It's Raewyn Connell, by Raewyn Connell. And it struck me as really interesting, and I just could never get it out of my mind. And I found the book fortuitously at a secondhand bookstore for $6.
What a bargain.
I know.
Especially for a scholarly text, my God.
Yeah, literally. I have a good habit of making that happen. So I picked it up and I thought, oh, okay, great. I can read it and discuss it with Claudia. So you mentioned this book in your confirmation seminar. So I'm curious about why you were told, I'm presuming your supervisors told you to read this book.
I actually think I came upon by myself, but I mean, well, when I say myself, it's kind of impossible to ignore in the sphere of research that I do, right? Like anything to do with the manosphere inevitably has to discuss masculinity in some sense, and Connell's work on hegemonic masculinity in particular is just like so foundational to so much of our contemporary understanding of masculinity. So it was one of those books, I think, I'm pretty sure I referenced hegemonic masculinity. No, I mean, I definitely referenced hegemonic masculinity in my honours thesis. without having read the book.
Who's ever done that?
No, we all always read the entire text from which we are taking an idea, right?
Run.
Cover to cover, always. And so I think it was one of the first texts that I read for my PhD because I was like, I know that this is so foundational. I really should dive deeper and make sure that my understanding of hegemonic masculinity is sound and not just this kind of like, I don't know, you probably know in academia, I feel like concepts can kind of morph this like series of whispers, basically just through like academics referencing a concept because they saw another academic reference it, and like so on until the actual meaning of it.
It happens all the time in political theory or like in like international relations where they'll like take a concept from political science theory and it just gets completely bastardized to the point not what the original thinker meant at all by that term.
Yes, and I'm not sure if you read her, and I think it's Messerschmitt's response or like, you know, follow-up article that they wrote, kind of, I guess, responding to the huge amount of literature that came from this book, Masculinities, and the ways in which it was kind of misunderstood, I think, or misapplied by some theorists or academics as well, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, so it's a sort of foundational text for masculinity studies. Is that a thing? Or?
Yeah. Critical masculinity studies, even just gender theory more broadly. I think, you know, she talks about in the kind of semiotic way that masculinity is masculinity because it's not femininity, right? So these things kind of always go hand in hand.
They're relational.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So not to kind of put you on the spot too much, but if you were to summarize, like, what's the too long didn't read takeaway of this book? Like, what's Connell's thesis?
I mean, I think at the core of the book is, I mean, the idea that has been taken and run with the most, which is hegemonic masculinity, which is this idea of masculinity as being contextual and a hegemonic masculinity being used to validate the subordination of women, I think is quite key. But what I really like about the idea of hegemonic masculinity, and I think it's in a lot of ways quite similar to Butler's theory of gender performativity, is this idea of gender not being static, that it's iterative, that it's performative, that it's socialized, all of these things that, go against what we were kind of talking about before about, you know, what Jordan Peterson would say about masculinity is that it's innate, that it's essential, that it's, or even, you know, the kind of scientific, you know, well, you're a man because you have these chromosomes, or
this level of testosterone.
Yeah, or like the large gametes produced by, I don't know, they all talk about like gender in these like super like biological ways, but that's not how we exist through the world. Like, I don't actually know your chromosomes in the way that you don't actually know my chromosomes. It's just that I perceive you as a man because you perform as a man, you introduce yourself as a man, you speak about yourself as a man. You know, this is these things aren't as innate or natural, I think, as is often construed.
Yeah, there's a great line, and I just found it that quickly, which it says, gender exists precisely to the extent that biology does not determine the social.
Exactly.
Which is what you just described.
And it's kind of, I mean, and, you know, this is also a complex debate in itself, but, you know, it's why there is, for some theorists, the distinction between sex and gender, right? It's like, and again, like, this is very contested, and I think Butler, in their latest book, Who's Afraid of Gender, kind of does a great job of complicating the binary between sex and gender, or even collapsing it completely. But there is the argument that sex is separate from gender, and, you know, sex referring to biology and gender being referring to performance. Yeah.
So we can kind of, you know, simplistically think of it as like biology and culture.
Yeah,
It's like two
yeah,
different,
yes.
to be reductive.
Very reductive, and I think again, is very much complicated by the fact that science is implicated by culture, inevitably.
So you referred to hegemonic masculinity as, I guess, performing this like legitimating function, which is one of the things I underlined in this book, where Connell says that hegemonic masculinity can be defined as the configuration of gender practice which embodies the currently accepted answer to the problem of the legitimacy of patriarchy, which guarantees the dominant position of men and the subordination of women. So I guess if we think about, that makes sense to me as like a political theorist, because she's saying that hegemonic masculinity is answering a legitimation problem. Like, how do we legitimate this form of rule? It's through the concept of hegemonic masculinity. And so if we just think about, if you think about a sexist that you know, what would they say? They say, oh, well, men are smarter, or they're more rational, they're stronger. So that's basically the idea, right? That it's performing this legitimating function. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I think as well, maybe part of the reason why her concept is sometimes misconstrued or misinterpreted is because I think it's quite intentionally vague or open-ended, because and I think she discusses this again in the book and in other elsewhere. Hegemony is, contingent. It's always in flux, and it's contextual. Hegemonic masculinity means something different in America than it does in China, right? These things are very, culturally determined or prescribed. And yeah, I think, and even if we think about the ways in which, going back to geek masculinity, I would say that it's kind of in this current, techno, as Varoufakis would say, techno-feudalist world. I think that the hegemonic masculinity in, for example, Silicon Valley is also having a huge influence, precisely because, figures like Musk have so much cultural influence via social media platforms. And, similarly with Tate and Peterson and that kind of thing, where I don't think that, and, I know that hegemonic masculinity isn't kind of a static thing to be understood. It's kind of more of a influx concept.
Well, yeah, you said it's kind of intentionally vague, and I suppose that is the point, because the primary thing that I took away from this book was the idea that there is no such thing as a fixed masculinity, right? Connell is trying to get away from any form of essentialism. And that was the most interesting part of the book for me, which I kind of, I'd already just assumed was true, but she does a good job at explaining it, about how our current understanding of like what a real man is, what it is to be masculine, is really only about 400 years old. And it's tied up in the experience of like European industrialization and colonialism.
Yep.
But yeah, if you just go to like other cultures or other times, their idea of what it is to be a man, if they have that idea, is very, very different. So history kind of just provides the counterexample to Peterson, who's trying to give you this essentialist, very crudely biological definition of masculinity, which is just completely contradicted by history.
Absolutely. And I think you kind of see that across, like with all of these kind of essentialist ideas, even, and to go back to Butler, in Who's Afraid of Gender. And also, this is kind of across, transgender studies, research. The concept of gender is very new. It was like basically invented by like the sexologists in the 50s, right? Like all of these concepts that we take for granted and we see as normal or common sense are very new oftentimes in the grand scheme of things. And so that's what I think I often bristle at with these right-wingers who kind of talk about facts and logic, is it's like, well, once you actually look at the facts and logic, your argument doesn't hold up. So
we're probably preaching to the choir though. I definitely enjoyed this book, but as I said to you off air, I found it difficult to read.
Yeah, I'm curious to learn more about why.
I guess I think this book is probably a victim of its ambition. in that, well, it actually says this on the opening page, right? It's a little quote on the title page. How masculinities are made and how they differ, why gender change occurs and how men handle it, how social science understands masculinity, how we can pursue justice in a gendered world. I mean, any one of those lines could have been a book in itself, right? I think Connell's just trying to do a lot in this book.
I agree.
So the first part is basically epistemic, the science of masculinity. And she talks about different ways that people claim to know about masculinity. So psychoanalysis, which I will refrain from commenting on.
We know how much you love that.
I love listen to the episode on Freud if you want to know more about that. Sociology and I guess like positivism, like empirical data collection, that sort of stuff. So there's that, which in itself is hard to read, very dense. And then there's her own definition in chapter 3, which we kind of spoke about, hegemonic masculinity and gender as a practice and a performance. And then the part 2 of the book is really interesting because it's actually a presentation of like different interviews. There's like 3 different groups of men.
Very much more the like sociology part.
Yeah,
book, right?
It's just very sociology, like presenting qualitative interviews. 3 or 4 different groups of men, and how they relate to feminism, which is probably the most interesting part of the book. Well, not interesting, but probably like the most enjoyable to read. Because you're reading about people.
Yes.
And then chapter 8 is like this kind of history of like Western thought almost, and how it ties in with colonialism and the creation of the global capitalist order. And it's like, my background's in international relations, and I'm like, wow, okay, this is very ambitious. And there's a lot in there that I like find very interesting, like the construction of individualism as an experience born out of the Reformation. Like not a obvious or natural idea, but actually a cultural construction that was answering very particular social problems. So there's all these like huge ideas in this book that are just kind of touched upon.
Yeah.
And I found that I wanted more.
Yeah. But I guess like I kind of see the book, and I guess, you know, it's seminal for a reason, and that it was kind of one of the first of its kind in...
Yeah, it was, sorry to say, like 1995?
Yeah. And like in tackling this issue of what is masculinity, how does it function, all of the things that she sets out to do. And so I kind of almost see it as like a starting point and like a provocation for other academics, which I think has worked, right? Like I'm in kind of, I guess, ostensibly in masculinity studies now, and we are trying to, I don't think that it has been answered as to what's happening with men.
Well, what is happening with men? Okay, we will come back to that. There was one part of the book that like did actually blow my mind, and you'll probably think this is a really like trite observation.
I'm ready. No.
Like,
we're all on our own journey.
Has all these life studies of men, and even the men who identify as like heterosexual. Something that she finds is that not all, but at least half or more have had homosexual experiences throughout their life. And she talks about how the category of being gay or just not heterosexual is a social category that gets kind of imposed upon people. And I was just thinking, well, like, if most people have actually had homosexual experiences and we didn't have these like very rigid social categories, like I just, for the first time, I actually really sort of understood what it meant to say these things are social construction.
Yeah.
Because I was like, oh, that's actually true.
Yeah.
Like, that makes sense to me.
For sure. And you know, I think internalized homophobia functions in such interesting ways, and you can kind of, or you know, I mean, one of the internet jokes is about how Grindr crashes during the RNC, right? Which just goes to show, right? Like, repression, and not that I'm, you know, necessarily in like researching sexuality, but repression is a damned thing. It's like, and you know, and you kind of see it in the manosphere. Something that I am interested in, that I am yet to kind of like look at in depth, but I will be doing, is looking at the like homoeroticism of the manosphere. You know, Andrew,
someone who's into combat sports, I can tell you all about that.
Exactly, right? It's like Andrew Tate is very few women's ideal man. He's a man's ideal man,
Exactly.
right? So what's happening there? I want to know.
People who admire him are not women.
Exactly, exactly. So I think like, and I think it has a lot to do with, you know, how sex is talked about more broadly and the ways in which it's like understood more broadly in culture and society. And I'm also really interested kind of at the moment, I have a feeling that there's this really big anti-sex backlash that's happening, whether that be kind of in the like no fap movement in the manosphere, which is, for those of you who don't are lucky enough to not know, men who abstain from masturbation because they think that it's like gonna help with their testosterone, basically. It's kind of all part of this biohacking sort of shit, right?
Give them more energy,
Yeah.
help them focus,
Exactly.
all that sort of stuff. There's no evidence.
No, there's no evidence. It's all pseudoscience. It's all bullshit. But then also, you know, I don't even think that this is necessarily just a right wing backlash. You can kind of see it with like, you know, woke Zoomers online who are like, this movie had too many sex scenes. Like, what were the sex scenes in this? Like, blah, blah, blah. Or, you know, there was like recent discourse about the over-sexualization of Sabrina Carpenter and all of these things. And so I'm just like, very kind of off topic, but I'm very interested in this like anti-sex backlash that's happening too.
I hadn't heard of that. I knew of no fap, obviously.
Yeah.
I didn't know that was part of a broader.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it's really been fully studied or understood yet, but you know, as I was talking about, like with my kind of instincts for these discourses earlier on, that's kind of where, you know, that's where my instincts are leading me at the moment, is what's going on with sex.
Wow. So the funny thing about the whole no fap thing is, I said there's no science behind it. It's actually not true. There's science indicating the opposite, right? Because I know of someone who's like, they're trying to have kids, and the doctor's advice to the man was to masturbate every morning.
What?
Because then your body starts to produce fresh, more potent semen, right? So the exact opposite is going on. It actually triggers your body to produce more sperm and, I imagine, testosterone. I don't know. It's not the case that like if you're constantly wanking, less virile. Like that's just like, of course, the exact opposite is the truth. Which is just really weird to me that I've never understood that whole movement.
No, it's a strange one. Maybe one for future research.
Yeah, I guess it does go back to like, it's probably got elements of repression.
Yeah, and you know, I also think there's something about this like the neoliberalization of the self, and the self as the entrepreneurial subject that needs to be maximized and enhanced in every possible way. You know, that's kind of Andrew Tate's and all of those like crypto hustlers shtick, right?
Which is ironic because, you know, Tate says escape the matrix.
Of course.
But he's just telling people to, as you say, like fully embrace the neoliberal logic.
Exactly.
Yourself as like an entrepreneur.
Exactly. And, you know, and with the, I guess like with the whole kind of manosphere, they base a lot of their identity around being how they, like, or what they perceive to be countercultural, right? They see themselves as like edgy and speaking truth to power, and, you know, they're saying the quiet part out loud, what no one else can say, blah, blah, blah. And they see themselves as countercultural or against the mainstream, but transgressive. But what they're doing is just reifying the norms that we currently exist within, right? Which is, again, why I think that the relationship between the manosphere and the mainstream is a lot more cyclical than it is unidirectional, because, you know, like, to be misogynistic, to be patriarchal or anti-feminist isn't radical. It's actually the most normative thing you can be.
Yeah.
Right?
So let's go back to your day-to-day PhD research on the manosphere. So what is your research question? What are you trying to answer by the end of this thesis?
Okay, this is gonna lead to the dreaded question that I know is coming. But the questions that I'm trying to answer are firstly, what are the ideologies of the manosphere? What do they believe in? Yeah. What do they think? And then the second one is how have how have these ideologies moved beyond the boundaries of, the manosphere's constituent communities and into the mainstream? Or how and why, basically.
So what are the ideologies and how are they being mainstreamed?
Yes, basically.
Cool. That makes sense. And so the dreaded question is, what is ideology?
Okay, what is ideology? How do I define ideology? I mean, it's like essentially the beliefs that we have in order to make sense of the world, right? And often those beliefs, I guess, like in a normative way, like these are not good or bad. I'm not trying to pass judgment. I mean, misogyny is pretty bad. Something that I always come back to, in my research, but also in my life, is be hard on systems, soft on people. So how do the systems work to produce ideologies? How do systems work to produce beliefs and validate certain worldviews in order, in ways... So in order for people to make sense of the world and move through their lives without kind of being in constant cognitive despair.
Yep.
And,
It's like a map.
Yeah, exactly.
Talk about cognitive maps.
Yeah, exactly. And oftentimes these are incoherent. I don't think there is I don't know if there is any ideology that's completely coherent and devoid of some sort of cognitive dissonance. But I think, when it comes to, for example, the ways in which masculinity is constructed in these subcultures or in the manosphere, it is often essentialist, for example, and I guess what my research is trying to do is to be okay, why do men have these essentialist beliefs about gender, and what does having an essentialist belief about gender do? Why is that appealing? And oftentimes I think it's kind of externalizes. It's the external locus of control, right? It's when you say, oh, it's just biology, it's just the way things are, it's just how people were born, you no longer have to do the work of looking inward or critically analyzing the world you exist in, or the media you consume, or the social interactions that you have, and question whether, does it always have to be this way? Do things, or for them it's just okay, this is the way things are and this is the way things should be because masculinity is biology.
Right. Well, yeah, that's interesting because that again sort of highlights one of the contradictions that you spoke about earlier within the manosphere, because there's part of it that's the Peterson side of it, which is more kind of self-helpy. But then that ideology of essentialism and removing a sense of agency is, that's black pill. That's there's nothing I could do about.
Yeah.
So that seems to me like a pretty important contradiction.
Yeah, and I don't think it's one that they know how to reconcile. But again, I think these dissonances exist everywhere, right? I guess, yeah, with this, the part of what happens with this, the essentialism of the manosphere is it all, and and it also happens with Peterson, right? Is it often legitimizes hierarchies. That's kind of, I think, a key way in which these ideologies function, is in order to legitimize their position or the position that they want to have. So that, and it removes guilt, right? If you say well, I am smarter and stronger than a woman, therefore I deserve the promotion over my, probably equally as capable female colleague. And if you think about it in an essentialized way, then you don't have to think about the systems that may be working at your benefit or to your benefit at the cost of another. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. Off air, I told you about the book by Raewyn Connell, The Idea of Critical Theory, which talks about ideology quite a lot. And I just found my review of it to see if I summarized how he defines ideology or how critical theory defines ideology. So let me read this to you and see if it resonates with you. An ideology is a comprehensive worldview which orients people towards their society. It encompasses their cultural practices, religious and political beliefs, values, as well as their wants and desires. Critical theory has the negative feature that ideologies systematically distort people's understanding of their desires and their position within society. Ideologies do this by providing people with a false understanding of their interests, causing them to unwittingly act in ways that reproduce their own servitude.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would mostly agree with that. I guess I kind of, and maybe this is kind of contentious, I don't necessarily see ideology as like a necessarily bad thing, right? Like, I think in a lot of ways ideology is necessary. I think ideology serves a very important function in society. But, you know, I think ideology, as with pretty much anything, can and should be critiqued, especially the ones that, you know, have demonstrable harm.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, everyone has an ideology, but people who claim to not have an ideology are probably the biggest ideologues you've ever met, right?
Jordan Peterson,
any standard liberal who thinks that liberalism is just like neutral. That's all ideology.
Exactly.
So yes, everyone has an ideology. It's not necessarily bad, but not all ideologies are created equal.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so you want to know what their ideologies are, how they're being mainstreamed. So methodologically, like day to day, like what are you doing? How do you research this?
Yes, so I conducted a digital ethnography. So for anyone who doesn't know what an ethnography is, the idea is that you kind of go into the field and you know, exist amongst your participants. And the goal is to get an insider's perspective of how a community functions. Obviously...
So you look.
Yes. Well, so a traditional ethnography, right, and which has roots in anthropology and is like, you know, has been very rightfully critiqued in a lot of ways because it was often very colonialist, very white supremacist in the ways in which these white researchers would go into, you know, small African communities and have this like very gross perception of what they're observing, right? Obviously, this has been updated, changed a lot over the years. But the idea of a digital ethnography is basically the same, but with an online community. And even though a traditional ethnography, both, you know, in person and digitally, often requires involvement of your participants. So often like unstructured interviews, you can have like informal conversation, that kind of thing. But, you know, the manosphere is a pretty toxic place. They are not very accepting of women. They're not accepting of researchers, both things which I am. So I took on, as you mentioned, the positionality of a lurker. And I can kind of justify that positionality, right, in that that's how a lot of us exist online. You know, again, you know, using what the incels, you know, using a very popular incel idea of the Pareto principle, which they would use to say that I think it'd be like 20% of men get 80% of women, you know. But in, I guess, an online context, and, you know, this is obviously not statistically accurate, but kind of gives you an idea of how online communities function. It's, you know, 20% of users creating 80% of posts. So very few people are actually active participants. If you go back to like participatory theory and like Henry Jenkins and that kind of thing, the idea of an online context is that even though not everyone participates, there's still the opportunity to. Um,
Sorry to
yeah.
interrupt. Wouldn't that mean that if 20% of the people are producing 80% of the content on, let's say, something like any sort of incel or manosphere forum, I'm guessing, and maybe I'm wrong, that the people creating the content would be the most extreme
Mhm.
in their beliefs. And so does that mean that like actually most people who are in these places are not as extreme in their beliefs as what you're seeing in terms of what like the content that's being posted?
I mean, I think that's an interesting, something that I kind of grapple with a little bit as well, is, how representative is my data of the average person, right? But I'm not thinking about this as, is this representative of the worldview of these people necessarily? Because, and again, like there are so many disparate ideas that, and often contradictory ideas within these spaces. But in taking on the positionality of the lurker, I am reading what anyone else is reading, right? Like if what I'm reading is the most extreme form of manosphere ideology, that's what other people are reading too. Like they are also reading the most extreme form. So, yeah, I mean, I totally get your point. I think that it just goes to show though how, like, again, these platforms function as um breeding grounds for extremist ideology.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm just trying to cling on to a bit of hope.
Green track.
Not everyone who listens to Peterson or Andrew Tate is like 100% on board with like
Yep.
everything that they say.
And I think that part of again, like with the incels, with the gatekeeping and boundary work that they do, part of it is about ideological commitment. So for example, if on these incel forums someone kind of expresses any sort of like ambivalence or doubt or even, about the ideology.
Women aren't that bad.
Yeah, or maybe like, oh, I have a new colleague and she is actually seems really normal.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
Like that will be shouted down immediately and might even result in you getting banned off the platform, right? So there's even like these systemic ways in which extremism is facilitated and promoted by these forums.
That's really interesting how like when people's real life experience like contradicts the things that they're being told in these like online spaces. Do you think that like how do you think they cope with that cognitive dissonance?
I mean, I think often through a kind of like head in the sand,
Yeah.
like approach to the world, which is anything that challenges my worldview, I'm either going to ignore or deride. Like,
Or perhaps like make it exceptional. Like that female colleague is like not indicative of women in general being normal, but she's abnormal, right? She's okay, but the rest of them are bad.
exactly. And so one of like the biggest criticisms that it's kind of like thrown at different users on these incel platforms is, oh, you're cherry picking. So if someone comes in and says, if with the hypergamy idea of women dating up, if they come in and they're like, oh, look at this celebrity couple, he's obviously punching, like she's obviously has a higher SMV than he does, then that'll immediately be shouted down as, dude, you're cherry picking. Like that's not.
That they don't see themselves as cherry.
No, exactly.
Of course.
Exactly. But I think like going back to what you were saying about um these people kind of like just existing online and they're never gonna uprise because they're too, they're just existing in their mom's basements type thing.
Yeah.
I guess and I guess this kind of like is why I moved away from researching incel specifically to looking at the broader manosphere, is I just feel like yes, of course, incels have been responsible for horrendous acts of violence. Just like truly like so horrific and really, really saddening. And that's, you know, why they're such a widely studied community. But I think that the ideology that they represent and the ideology that the broader manosphere um, represents a type of violence and harm towards women and minorities that that is like quite banal, you know, as opposed to like these extremist forms of mass shootings and that kind of thing. It's just like just an increase of a misogynistic worldview can be used to, you know, validate just like regular acts of, you know, sexual violence against women, domestic violence, and, you know, and you're seeing that in, for example, classrooms with the harm that Andrew Tate is having, with, you know, teenage boys bullying their female teachers so much that there's a huge exodus of women from the teaching profession because, of course, they can't handle the rampant misogyny that they're forced to endure in the classroom.
So to try and wrap things up, hopefully optimistically, what do you see as the way forward? Like how do we combat these ideologies? How do we combat the manosphere, or can we not?
Yeah.
What do you think?
I'm probably going to give you a not so optimistic answer.
Right.
I don't think there is a band-aid fix. You know, the Australian government's trying to introduce this social media ban, as we've discussed it.
No, you don't like.
Which I
convinced me it's a bad idea.
Exactly, because it's horrendous. It's going to cause so many unforeseen issues. You know, but at the same time, where we live in this increasingly right-wing environment where the elites aren't even pretending to be liberal anymore. I mean, with the recent Mark Zuckerberg announcement that Meta's gonna stop fact-checking and start prioritizing political content again. I mean, it's not that different from what they're already doing, but it is like a mask-off moment of saying, like, we don't even, like, saying, and even to their shareholders, like, we don't even care about truth or, you know, civility or anything like that, because we know that we know the harms that come from these policies and like these types of things, right? Like whether that be violent, like, you know, doxing, harassment, all that kind of stuff. So I do think we're kind of like living in this increasingly right-wing environment. Trump's in social media is like too far gone, I think, to try and do anything about.
Blue sky isn't the new hope.
Blue sky isn't the way. It's too fucking boring. But following me on blue sky. Yeah, I mean.
Okay, so do we? I mean, remember when I first met you, you were telling me that how you're a big proponent of BreadTube.
Yes.
Like, do you still think that like left-wing content creators have a really important role to play in combating this sort of stuff, or are they just talking to a different echo chamber and it's not really going to do much?
I think probably the latter, and I think mostly, and this kind of comes back to like materialism, it's because there's no money in left-wing media. It's like right-wing
left-wing media.
Exactly. Like even if you think about like the Daily Wire, it's like a multi-million-dollar company that just pumps out right-wing bullshit. And it's like created there's like a whole very robust right-wing media network ecosystem that is thriving, partly because it gets a lot of funding in ways that left, like, it does not exist on the left. Or like any funding that kind of maybe partially exists on the left is like going towards like Pod Save America. So, and you know, this is a issue that I guess, going back to your question about how do we fix this, what do we do, is there any optimism? Something that I discussed with my supervisor a lot is like, it just feels like the whole thing needs to be totally reformed. Like, the manosphere exists because we live in a patriarchal world, and that isn't changing, and there is nothing that's being done to address that in any large scale systemic way. And it's the same with wealth inequality, with systemic racism. All of these things are so entrenched that I just don't see any kind of report or single piece of legislation doing anything significant to help the problem.
Fucking hell.
But I mean, okay, my piece of like hope.
Yeah, please. How do you get through that?
Yeah.
Like, you must have something.
Well, okay. I obviously look at this shit like all day, every day. Like and even outside of my research, it's the thing that I obsess over, that I like spend all of my free time thinking about, researching, watching YouTube videos about. And yet I would say that I'm a relatively down-to-earth person who has real life friends and community and hobbies. And so, as trite as it is to say, like, sometimes it is about touching grass.
Yeah. Oh, right.
Like, it is about, and with what I said before about be hard on systems, soft on people, I do kind of have like this approach to my research of like almost radical empathy. Like, these people who I know fundamentally hate me. They are kind of, people who are against miscegenation and hate women and all of these things. I choose to believe that these people are not born bad or with these ideas, right? They are a product of their environment. They're a product often of, abuse or really difficult backgrounds, of systemic wealth inequality often. Maybe they're undiagnosed, neurodivergent, all of these things, right? And so I just have to choose, as naive as this may be, to ultimately believe that people are fundamentally not even necessarily good, but at least not bad, right?
Malleable.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I think like the research is important, because to understand why people believe these things, I think, is kind of like the first step.
Yeah. Well, speaking of left-wing media, have you heard of Novara Media?
No.
It's UK based, and they have a interesting podcast / YouTube show with Ash Sakar. She interviewed a PhD candidate, much like yourself. He's Irish, but he's based in the US, and his research is on incels. I'll send it to you; it's quite good. And she's
Lots of Irish people doing incel research.
Interesting. She starts the podcast with like her own recorded intro where she's like, look, like I've made a lot of fun of incels in the past, but like when I had this conversation, I realized that really these people are just like incredibly lonely. And that's not really a group of people that you should mock, because they're going through a hard time. And as you said, like perhaps the solution is to touch grass, but like build like real life communities in which people can have these like disconfirming beliefs about the crap that they're seeing online.
Absolutely. And I think with the incel community and with a lot of these online subcultures and the manosphere, it is so often people who feel so lonely and isolated and alienated in their real lives that what they are doing is looking for community. But because that community is so toxic and requires radicalization in order to be accepted in that community, it becomes this self-perpetuating cycle of they can't do anything that would go against the beliefs of the community, because then they would lose that community, right? So it is very difficult to break that cycle.
And there was someone else who was studying like online right-wing radicalization at Melbourne Uni, in the politics department, I think. And I went to their completion seminar, and he made the point that like actually shutting people down for articulating these kind of views is counterproductive. Because if people feel that they can't even talk about, if they're having doubts about this stuff, but they feel like they can't even begin to talk about it because they'll get immediately shut down and shamed, then that just keeps them trapped in that online community and they can't leave. So it is actually very counterproductive. So is the solution just to be a bit more empathetic to people?
Yeah, and I think and maybe this is kind of where I dissent from some portions of, the online left, is I do think that there is maybe a tendency to be overly censorious. And as much as I bristle at the idea of the marketplace of ideas and what's the best idea coming out on top, I don't necessarily think that's always the case. I do think that shutting down these conversations often only makes people more curious about them, right? It's that impulse of if you say that I can't do that thing, it makes me want to do the thing more.
Yeah.
It's the ideological equivalent of that, right? So I think there needs to be, I think, a balance struck, and I don't know what this balance is, between allowing people to express their doubts or concerns or questions in ways that aren't immediately shut down, but in ways that also don't just allow bigotry to run rampant, right?
Yeah.
This is kind of the paradox of tolerance is you can't, how do you tolerate intolerance? That kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. Yeah, I mean, people often say that people like left-wing policies but hate left-wing people. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think there's a lot of truth in that. I frequently myself hate left-wing people.
Yeah.
I say a left-wing person.
And I think the advice to touch grass again also goes to the online left.
Yeah.
There are some, really ideologically dogmatic people who assume that everyone has had the same life experience as them, right? So I think it's also about opening up conversations to people who've had radically different world experiences, because what if you grew up in a really right-wing household and have just adopted those opinions because that's all you're ever exposed to? I think that those people as well should be allowed to change their mind. They should be encouraged to change their mind. But that change isn't going to happen if you just yell at them.
Yeah, if they adopt a siege mentality, then nothing's going to get in.
Exactly.
Well, we've gone for 80 minutes. I think that's a pretty good place to...
Yeah, please cut out a lot.
That was a long one, but I think it was a good one. So.
Okay, I'm glad. I'm glad you think so. I feel like I spoke a lot of shit, and I hope that you can cut it all together to make some sort of sense.
I think it makes perfect sense. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you've made it this far, don't forget to rate the show wherever you listen to it, or consider sharing the podcast with a friend. Thanks, and see you next time.